I thought I might just have a little bit of a try at answering or addressing the issue of how we ground these things in reality. And this has, of course, been one of the chief debating points with the range of stated preference techniques. I mean, basically what we're doing here is asking people questions in hypothetical circumstances. And if we've all done our Economics 101, we'd think, well, if you're asking people hypothetical questions, then what you're going to get are hypothetical answers. People perhaps won't think very much about what they're saying. Maybe they'll even take a little bit of time to think about it and act strategically to give answers that perhaps will generate outcomes that they see as advantageous to themselves. So one of the nice things that that people have tried to do in this field is to ground these stated preferences with reference to actual decisions being taken. And that can be done quite easily if you have some relationship with an existing market. So if you're asking people to make a set of questions in hypothetical circumstances that are fundamentally built on an existing market, so, you know, what would you do if the market changed, if the products changed from that to this, then what's your choice? You can then bring together those revealed preferences in markets with the statements of preferences from things like choice modelling, bind the two together, and in a very sort of econometrically sophisticated way, see if there's any scaling factor between the choices made in a hypothetical situation and those made in reality. So that's one nice way that's been used. It can be used in food choices. It can be used in recreational choices, for instance. It's a lot tougher to do it, though, when you're dealing with things like non-use values of wetlands, like was the case in Vietnam, where there are no reference points. And that's even more difficult because if you do, say, go out into the field and start playing games with real money, then exactly the opposite strategic incentives are at work. So if you ask questions about what you're willing to pay when there's no payments being made, you might see some incentive to overstate values. But if you actually go out there and start saying, well, what would you really pay? Here, right, you know, give me the cash, then the classic free rider sort of incentives come to play. So there's no way there of knowing what the truth is. The only thing we can do in those sorts of circumstances is to try to see how well our models fit. If you can start to see whether or not people are making their hypothetical choices so that the different levels of the attributes make a difference to their choices, to make sure that the money attribute is significant, determinant of choice. If you can see that perhaps some of the socioeconomic characteristics of the respondents that you'd predict to determine choices, if they're significant indicators or predictors of choice, then you can have some confidence in the internal validity of the choices. For instance, you know, higher income people would be expected to make choices that have more environmental or more food safety attribute strength, so it's sort of normal good that you'd expect. So if you can get that model validity sorted out, you're some way towards saying that people have made choices in a hypothetical circumstance, certainly, but they make sense in terms of behavioural predictions.
About the hypothetical biases and choice experiment method as well as a contingent valuation method, I just want to add a point. There are a few but increasing number of studies that compare the values that come from such hypothetical choices versus real choices in real markets. For example, one study that comes to mind is List et al. 2006. What they found is that they did a choice experiment side by side, a real market experiment, and what they found is when you include a cheap talk script, as in telling the respondents that even though this payment is hypothetical, we want you to consider it because it might influence policy, people are more likely to give their answers, the real answers that are similar to the choices that they will make or the willingness to pay they would reveal in real markets. So I think there's still some research to be done comparing the valuation or the willingness to pay values that come from hypothetical choices versus real choices. Having said that, it's not always possible to to sell everything in a real market. For example, we do a lot of work on genetically modified food, which are not yet released, so we cannot sell it in a real market, hence we have to use hypothetical methods. Or the environmental issues, you cannot sell a panda, for example, you cannot sell specific species in the market, so you cannot use real market experiments. Another issue that you raised was about scalability of our findings from local to global. I think that that is an issue that comes up in a cost-benefit analysis. So what is the population that we should be considering, we should be aggregating, and should be weighing different segments of the population? And I think research on that is ongoing. And one question you also asked was about how to give the information and how to give the information to a greater group of people. Some of the choice experiments, for example, we're doing, and some other colleagues are doing, they do treatments in a choice experiment, giving the information in different ways. That's whether through radio or through written material, through meetings in the village centers, etc., to see what kind of information, what is the best way of disseminating information before people make choices. So that kind of issue could also be investigated by doing choice experiments.
I'm Greg Michaels from Chemonics. I appreciate what you're doing, and we know that you're filling an important vacuum when it comes especially to non-traded goods or things that aren't traded on markets. I think all of us make decisions about things we purchase in market. We realize after the fact that we paid too much or we weren't happy with it. And so it takes time to learn markets, and we realize that. One thing I wonder is what advice you give in the book or can give in terms of how good is this information for policy making? I mean, maybe it's better that some of this information is better as an ordering of preferences rather than thinking about what you've described as important, which is marginal valuation. Do you have any sense on the general question about how well and which way can this information be used for policy making?
Over the last couple of years, one of the creeping policy challenges that has emerged, at least in Australia, has been an ordinalist approach to policy making. And that's most critically obvious through the use of techniques like multi-criteria analysis. This is of some concern to me because primarily I see those sorts of techniques as being wide open to rent-seeking behaviour. My opening remarks there this afternoon were about transparency and human-based, people-based and information-based. And it really worries me when policy instruments are being designed with recourse to information that I feel is being manipulated. Now, what we're getting from these choice experiments is information that is coming directly from the people who are going to be impacted by policy. In order to be able to really assess those policies, I think we have to get cardinal. Okay, we have to be able to do that balancing between the costs and the benefits. And if you only have sort of rankings or sort of ordinal feel for which policy is better or worse than another, you still don't have the capacity to say, yes, but is it worth it? Right? Is it really going to be worth the costs that are involved here? And I really support what Derek was saying right at the start there. The win-wins, I'm just not sure that they're out there anymore. If they are, why haven't they? Why haven't the $50 notes been picked up off the sidewalk? I think we really are looking at those trade-offs, and I'm just not confident that we're going to be able to get them by having just rankings.
Thank you for the presentation. I have one area that I'd like you to clarify. So I was struck by the fact that the method is applied to value public goods. Is that correct? Was that one of the applications?
It can be.
It can be. But by definition, most public goods do have higher social benefits or higher social costs than the individuals who will be responding to the choices. So how does the method try to take into consideration the externalities which wouldn't be in the individual preferences and which the valuations are based? Because you could get a totally wrong answer because people just don't realize the benefit of a certain good because it's a public good.
Okay. Do you want to do that, or will I? You have a go first.
Yes. So what it is that before you ask people to state their choices, you explain to them what are the policies or the programs and what are the attributes of these that they are going to value. So you can't just tell them, oh, what is your willingness to pay, for example, for conservation of forests. You have to first explain to them what forests do, why they're important for example, air pollution or greenhouse gas emissions, the biodiversity conservation, etc. So you have to give them information about what it is that they're going to value. And then you also give them information about they're going to make a payment, whether it's hypothetical or not, generally hypothetical, but you also have to make them think about their budget trade-offs before they state their willingness to pay or make the choices that reflects their willingness to pay. So you have to give them information about the good before you make them make choices. So, yeah.
I'll just add a little to that, and it really relates to a point that Derek made as well that reminded me of it. I mean, what is it, say, with the oil palm in Indonesia? What's the externality that's being induced because of clearing the forests for oil palm plantations? Well, those externalities include, say, the increased probability of extinction of the orangutan. Right, so that's an external cost of a decision that you might make to buy cosmetics or cooking oil. So when we're asking people about that issue of oil palm plantation, we're focusing in on the values associated with the externalities. So they're being defined. You know, that's what you're buying when you're being given this choice. And Ekin's absolutely right. Part of the choice experiment process is delivering information to the respondents, and that's a tough issue because you might say, well, policies should be based on people's preferences. What are people's preferences? Well, they basically don't know anything about orangutans and oil palms, etc., etc. They just go and buy the cooking oil. The philosophy, I think, here is that we'd like to see policy being developed on the basis of informed preferences. So part of the choice experiment process is delivering information. How much information is a moot point. And in fact, quite often some of these issues are extremely controversial. If you ask about the probability of extinction of orangutan from a manufacturer of oil, from oil palm, they'll say, oh, it's not a problem. But if you go to WWF or another conservation group, they'll say it's a huge problem. So somewhere in between there, you have to distill a bunch of information that everyone can agree on as being truthful and honest representation of the issues involved. A deeper policy question then comes, you've then presented information to a subgroup of the population and you've estimated values of that subgroup, of that sample. How can you then extrapolate from the sample that's now well informed to the largely uninformed general population? Is it a viable policy process to engage in that extrapolation? Or should it be that you have to include as a cost of the policy a cost associated with giving everybody the same level of information that you gave to that subsample?
Peter Hazel, formerly IFPRI. Like Derek, I had some early forays into estimating risk aversion parameters amongst farmers playing little games, what we now call choice experiments. I remember we used to, when you did this for a sample of farmers, you get a reasonable mean estimate of, say, the risk aversion parameter, but you get a heck of a lot of noise. And you could run regressions and you could pick up and explain part of that noise with wealth and education, things like that. But the R-squares were typically very low, and I used to be sort of troubled about what did I really measure that I had all this unexplained noise or measurement error. I was wondering if your techniques today have got to the point where those measurement errors have really been shrunk down, that you have a lot more confidence in what you're dealing with.
Peter, if I can, and then I'll just pass over to Ekin. In my time of using these techniques, the ability to estimate strong, in this case, logit-based functional relationships has improved dramatically. And this is largely due to two things, I think. One is improved design of questioning, but I think the second one is dramatic improvements in the econometrics. And I don't claim to have been able to keep up with it all. It just seems to have, and continues to leap forward at extraordinary lengths with growing computational powers. But the sorts of things that my doctoral students seem to be able to do now are quite remarkable in terms of pulling in those standard errors and pushing up the pseudo R-squareds.
Again, in choice experiments, the R-square, we call pseudo R-square in discrete choice methods, can be low or high. It mainly depends on your previous design, how you designed your choice sets. So if you have an efficient design as orthogonal, and that can capture the main effects, then your R-square is more likely to be higher. But then again, there's some noise coming from the respondents. For example, the heterogeneity, whether observed or unobserved. And there are increasing number of methods or models that are trying to explain it. For example, we can use interactions of socioeconomic characteristics, as you said, to look at observed heterogeneity, or you can do mixed logit models or random parameter logit models or latent segmentations to find out the unobserved or specific segments in the population that might be having similar preferences. So there's most of the choice experiment literature is actually those 2 points that you mentioned. One is experimental design, how to design experiments that will increase the R-square or pseudo R-square, and then what are the econometric methods that can be used to minimize the noise as much as possible.
If I can just add in one more point, Peter, and that relates to the gentleman's question before. We all make mistakes when we make choices. You know, we all do that. You know, oh, geez, I've just bought a subway ticket yesterday, arriving off the train from New York, and I didn't read the instructions properly, so I paid too much. Okay, and I went, wasted a few dollars there. And we do that not just in markets, but we do it in choice experiments as well. The challenge with choice experiments, though, of course, is that there's often an unfamiliarity with the context of the choice that's being made. You're not usually asked to say how much tax you're willing to pay in order to get more orangutans. You know, it's an unfamiliar. It's not like buying a metro ticket, although some of us are less familiar than others in that regard. And we do learn, and there are some very interesting studies that demonstrate how through the progress of a choice experiment questionnaire, people do refine their choices, but they get to a point where they get bored with making choices, and they start to then blow out their standard errors on their choices. So, you know, there's a fine line there, and I think this is one of the lessons that was pointed out by our colleagues in the videos. A fine line between getting people experienced and knowledgeable and able to make these choices, and then just boring the pants off them.
Angelino Viceza from IFPRI. I wanted to go back on the issue of information, because I think it's actually quite important. Is it a worthwhile exercise to have people do an experiment in which you do not provide information and basically elicit uninformed preferences to try and assess how much that varies? I mean, I don't know if it's worth an exercise, and if so, have people looked at that? And then on the hypothetical bias, could you argue that essentially all choices people make will have some hypothetical bias in it? Therefore, if you compare across choices, you're essentially netting this out, or is that not an argument?
About different levels of information, not in the choice experiment context, but in the contingent valuation survey, contingent valuation context. This has been done to looking at people's willingness to pay with no information at all, with some level of information, with more level of information, and then the information given by different people through different, not language, but different terminology, etc., to see what will be effective way of communicating with people. So it is a fine line, as Jeff was saying, giving too much information so that they know as much as an expert. which normal people wouldn't, or given too little information that they can't make choices or they can't make decisions that are reliable. So there's been studies on that, and there are ongoing studies on the level of... Oh, the findings, it depends on the study, really, and depends on the issue that's being studied. For example, we've been looking quite a bit on genetically modified food and how to explain genetic modification. So we have it depends on the country context, depends on the farmers if they're already using, for example, BT maize or not. So it depends on the context, I'm afraid.
Can I just add one thing there very quickly? And Ekin wouldn't even know about this study. We've been doing work where we've been interviewing members of the general public about reef protection in Australia, tropical coral reef protection, and comparing the answers we're getting in those surveys to those answers of experts, right? People who have a training in tropical reef management, people who are ecologists, biologists, etc., and estimating independent samples and comparing those estimates. One of the principal criticisms we get from the sort of experts is you can't rely on the members of the general public to take decisions of such great responsibility. These are national treasures, national assets. These people don't know anything about reef conservation. We can't rely on them. This is irresponsible. The strange and wonderful thing about this little study we've been doing is that the estimates of value for the general public are not significantly different from those of the experts. Now, that's only one study and it's in one context, but we are aware of the sort of issue you've come up with, and we're working on that one. That's the result to date.
So if there is no other question, I want to ask two questions. Very quickly, 2 minutes. One is on the internal validity issue. And we have been using these techniques a lot, but I have still this issue of the benchmarking in the sense that you can try different levels of information, but the problem is that individuals who respond could have different levels of information within them. I can give you an example. We were doing some types of experiments to measure how people will rank themselves in terms of ethnicity, of racial characteristics. And the answers we got from each of the individuals were very different to the answers we got from survey takers observing them, which has been standardized. So the survey takers will rank them more closely to reality than what they were perceiving themselves as being ranked. So that asymmetry within could question a little bit the internal validity, which of course there is a lot of efforts in these randomized trials to do that. But the second was more on the external validity and more linked to this scaling up and so on. And what have you seen to try to strengthen the external validity so that you can argue scaling up capacities with these experiments? So Derek had to leave because I'm meeting. Thank you, Derek.
Do you want to do that, Megan?
About benchmarking, quite a few choice experiment studies that are being conducted recently. They're including for the status quo, that's the alternative that is constant across all choice occasions. They try to include information on the person's, the respondents' real values. So your status quo could be something that's given by the researcher, or could be something that is stated by the respondents. For example, for trying to look at farmers' acceptance or farmers' willingness to produce BT maize, we also ask them questions. We give them attributes of BT maize or new maize varieties, but we also ask them attributes of their own maize varieties, so that we can compare, we can benchmark according to what they're willing to pay, how they're being to move from their own status quo, which varies from farmer to farmer, respondent, to the choices that we're offering to them. So it can be incorporated, the benchmark could be incorporated in the choice experiment design. And about external validity, about scaling up, some choice experiments did include different scales of the good and try to compare them across whether scalability is an issue, which is a big issue in contingent valuation studies, for example. And if it's embedded correctly, and if you did the correct background work on the focus group discussions, and you are using or the consultations with the experts, if you're including the correct scale of the good that you're valuing, then it shouldn't be a problem, I think.
Very quick response. There are two issues that we look at in terms of this. One is scale, and the other is scope. little bit confusing. Scale we're defining as you increase the quantity that's being supplied, do you observe diminishing marginal utility? So is are additional units worth less as we increase the scale? And what we're trying to do there is to establish that there is diminishing marginal utility. That's what you'd expect from theory. So more attention's being paid to the functional forms of the utility functions that are being estimated. The second thing is the scope of the problem. And when I talk about scope, I'm talking about the overall context of the issue that's being analysed. For instance, in Derek's Indonesian forest example, are you talking about all tropical forests internationally, or are you talking about a 10-hectare site for a proposed nature reserve in an island in Indonesia? Very, very different scopes, and of course you'd expect that scope difference would have a difference in terms of the values that people hold for them, and we're getting very strong evidence of that scope effect being real.
Okay. Thank you so much. Oh, yes, you have a question.
Hello. You had mentioned focus groups several times in terms of determining, I guess, the different types of attributes for whatever you're interested in. And I was wondering if there was any work around kind of cross-checking or triangulating qualitative focus groups in terms of their own ranking and scoring of attributes versus the quantitative approach, and seeing if there is, if they match, and if so, I mean, what does that tell us? And if not, then is there a problem with the technique one way or the other? Just any work on that at all?
Well, in the focus group discussions, you do ask people to say what are the different important attributes of this, for example, this policy or program or a good that's being developed. What are the important attributes? And you can also ask them to rank depending on the gender of the focus group discussant or the age of the focus group discussions. And yeah, you ask them first what are the important attributes, and then you ask them to rank them. And then you can, of course, score them, for example. Yeah, exactly. You can give them little stones and say how many stones would you put on this attribute versus that attribute. And then, yes, you can compare the ranking that comes from the focus group discussions with the ranking that would come from the choice experiment analysis. Yeah.
And have there been results saying they match or don't match?
Yeah, I can't really think at the top of my head. I'm sure there are many studies that would rank, but it also depends if your focus group discussants are representative of the population you sampled from for the choice experiment. So often people go for convenient focus group samples and not really representative focus group samples. So I guess it depends on sampling.
Well, just to add that, I'm not aware of studies that have done what you're suggesting. I think one of the trends is that the distinction between the focus group and the full survey is becoming a little bit blurred, particularly because quite often enough questions are asked in the focus groups to develop a rudimentary choice model and rudimentary estimates of people's values for the individual attributes. Okay, and it's from those rudimentary estimates of value that we create more advanced experimental designs for the full survey. So if you've got some priors of your attribute values for the final questionnaire, you can be much smarter in terms of designing your experimental design so as to hone in more quickly, more efficiently, less costly on the attribute values in the main questionnaire.
Okay, so please join me in thanking Akin and Jeff for their presentation. Thank you so much.